Chapter 16. The Search. The cottage seemed very quiet without William. Tom missed the sound of his boots clattering along the tiled hallway and his chatter at night. In the days that followed his departure, he found himself glancing at the table to share something he had read, only to realise that the chair where he usually sat was unoccupied. He felt the old familiar emptiness that he had experienced after the sudden loss of Rachel. At least he could console himself that William was alive. He listened to the news on the wireless with extra attentiveness, particularly when there were reports of bombing near London. Hitler had by now invaded Norway and Denmark, and heavy units of the British fleet had been sent to help the invaded countries. But the war still left little Weerwald unruffled, except for those few who missed William. It was sad that he wasn't around to witness early spring. Already buttercups were appearing in the fields, and in the woods wet primroses and violets had burst through the soggy dark earth. Tom waited patiently for a letter. After the first week, when there was still no word from him, he thought William was probably too busy to write, for he would probably have his hands full doing chores for his mother. He thought the same the second week, but by the third week he began to feel anxious. He himself had written 4 letters, and he knew that Zack had sent several also, but there was no reply to any of them. One day he woke violently from a nightmare. In the dream he had been locked into a tiny space with no air inside. It was as though he was being buried alive. But it was the voice that had woken him. He thought he had heard William calling out to him for help. He woke with a jerk, only to find Sammy standing by his bedside, panting. He staggered out of bed and fumbled his way towards the bedroom window. Carefully easing the blackout curtains to one side, he peered out. It was still dark. He opened the door, walked across the hallway to the living room and looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m, almost time for his fire duty anyway. He'd go and relieve Hubert Pullet early. He pulled his corduroys, thick jersey and boots on over his pyjamas and stepped outside into the damp night, slinging his trench coat, cap and gas mask on as he walked. Sammy followed him, dragging a bit of old blanket in his teeth. The firepost was a makeshift platform on top of the village hall, a ridiculous piece of extravagance, Tom had thought when it was being built. He climbed up the ladder which leaned onto it. Mr. Pullet was sitting with a blanket wrapped round him and was in the process of falling asleep in a chair. He woke up, pleased to see Tom so early, and they chatted for a while until Mr. Pullet decided to leave for the warmth of his bed. Tom made himself as comfortable and as warm as possible, and Sammy snuggled in between his legs. As he stared at the sky, he couldn't rid himself of the dream he had just had. If William was in need of help, surely he would write to him. He gazed out at the galaxy of stars and brooded. 2 hours later, the dawn injected its colours into the sky, and Mrs. Butcher came and took his place. On the way home, he caught sight of Miss Thorne's sister, May, on her ancient bicycle. She was delivering the mail. He ran after her. "Nothing for you, I'm afraid," she said. "I'm sorry." She hesitated before moving off again. "Mr. Oakley," she added anxiously, "I'm afraid I have a telegram. It's for Annie Artridge." He looked up, startled. The last telegram had brought the news of Michael Fletcher's death. "I'm a little worried," she went on. "What with her baby due so soon. I'd like to wait till the midwife is visiting before delivering it, but it's against regulations." Tom frowned thoughtfully. "You see Mrs. Fletcher?" She shook her head. "Didn't like to disturb her." "I'll go and see her now. Suggest she might pop in to see her." "Oh, thanks." He watched her wobble off and head towards the farming area on the south side of the village. Turning sharply back, he walked in the direction of the Fletcher's cottage. Mrs. Fletcher had just seen her husband and Edward off to work. The kitchen door was still open, and the light from it was casting a pale glow onto the still glistening garden. She was standing at the doorway. "You ain't on duty, is you?" she asked, glancing guiltily at the light. "No, I ain't," said Tom. "I just want to have a private word like. George and David are asleep. They won't be bothering us. Come on in and have some tea. Yours is looking a little on the pale side." He stepped into the cosy warmth of the kitchen Sam padded after him and curled up on the floor in front of her range. She sat down at the table and poured out 2 cups of tea. "Sit down," she said, sliding a cup across to him. "What can I do for you?" Tom looked surprised. "There is something you wants me to do, ain't there? Is it Will?" Tom shook his head. "Annie Hartridge has got a telegram." Oh, Mrs. Fletcher put her cup down slowly. "David?" she asked. "I don't know. I just thought with you having lost Michael and with her about to have a baby, she might need someone who could help, like." "Of course," she said, and she stood up and hurriedly untied her apron. "She ain't got it yet," he added. She rolled down her sleeves. "I like to be there as soon as possible. In her state she might pass out or something. I'll think of an excuse, like extra eggs from the Padfields, booties for the baby, that sort of thing." Tom nodded. It sounded for the best. He watched her put her coat on. "Them trains to London?" he murmured. "Yes," she said, puzzled. "What about 'em?" "They run on Fridays, don't they?" "Yes, that's right." "It's Friday today, ain't it?" "Yes." He stood up abruptly. "I'm going to get on that train, Mrs. Fletcher, and what's more, I'm going to get on it today." Tom's journey to London was as bumpy and as intermittent as William's had been. Dim blue lights lit the tightly packed carriages and the air was stifling. It was frustrating, too, not to be able to see the stations that they passed, but once it was evening it was too dangerous to attempt to peep through the blacks in spite of the faintness of the blue lights. Sammy, who had not only smuggled himself into the cart but had also jumped off it and followed Tom to the station, was now squashed onto his lap. A makeshift lead made of rope hung from between his teeth. Tom, who had originally refused to allow Sammy to come with him, was now glad of his company. It was going to be a lonely task searching for William. It was 9 o'clock when the train pulled into London, and he clambered out with Sammy and stood on the platform feeling totally dazed. The noise was deafening. Hundreds of uniformed figures swirled about him, shouting to each other. Another train pulled out, and a voice over a tannoy system was calling out platform numbers and destinations. It was a while before Tom could orientate himself enough to hand his ticket in. He must have looked a strange sight with his thick white hair and weather-beaten face, clad in an old cord cap, overcoat and country boots, with Sammy barking nervously at his ankles. Peering through the hordes of young men, he finally spotted the ticket man, and he slung the haversack that he had borrowed onto his back. It was filled with clothes and food for William from people in the village. He handed his ticket in. The man looked down at Sammy. "Should have a muzzle, that dog," he exclaimed. Tom nodded, having no intention of ever getting one. "Where you from?" he continued. "You ain't a Londoner, that I know. On holiday, are you?" And he gave a loud chuckle at the absurdity of his remark. Tom looked at him blankly. "Only a joke," muttered the man. "Ain't you got no sense of humour?" "Where's Deptford?" asked Tom. "Deptford," imitated the man. "Never heard of it. Say it again." Tom repeated it, and the man shrugged. "And," he yelled to an ARP warden who was passing, "you know where Deptford is?" "Never heard of it," said Ern, "and I knows most places round London. Used to be a cabby. You got it writ down?" Tom handed him the piece of paper with the address on it. "Oh, you mean Deptford," they chorused. Tom repeated their pronunciation of it. "Deptford," he said quietly to himself. They waved their hands over to the left towards an archway and directed him towards a bus station. Tom thanked them and headed in the direction they had suggested. The two men watched him and Sammy walk away. "You don't half meet some queer uns here," said the ticket man. "I hope he ain't a German spy." And they gave a loud laugh. Tom held on to Sammy's lead firmly, for in the unlit street he kept colliding into people. He finally got onto a bus that would take him part of the way to Deptford. But it was a painfully slow journey. He stared in amazement at the conductress in her manly uniform. She was a little irritated at first, and then realised that he was a stranger to the city. "You one of them refugees?" she asked kindly. "No," he replied, "I don't think so." "Where you from, then?" Little Weirwold. She didn't understand him. His accent was too thick for her. In the country, is it? She shouted, thinking he might understand her better if she raised her voice. He nodded. What brings you to London? Come to see a little boy. Ooh, grandson, is he? Tom nodded. He knew it was a lie, but he didn't want to go into complicated explanations. Sammy sat obediently on his lap, and by the time Tom had changed buses and been directed and misdirected, it was midnight before he reached the area where Willie lived. Accustomed now to the darkness, he could make out only too clearly the awful living conditions. Small, dilapidated tenements stood huddled together, all in desperate need of care and attention. So, this was William's background, he thought. Suddenly a loud siren wailed across the sky. He froze. What was he supposed to do? He'd read about communal shelters in the newspapers, and he knew that people often crowded into the tubes, but he had no idea where the nearest tube station was. Come on, move over there, said a loud, brusque voice. Move on to the shelter. A group of people brushed past him, grumbling and cursing. Who's got the cards? Yelled a woman in the darkness. Alf, have you got my bleeding cards? A young woman bumped into him. Here, mind where you're going, mister, she rebuked sharply. Sorry, he muttered. He shouted after her. Where's you going? But she had run away. He felt a hand on his arm. It was a warden, a breezy man, not more than 10 years younger than him. You seem a little lost, sir. Come with me. Tom picked Sammy up in his arms and ran after him, towards a long brick building with a large grey S painted above the door. The warden, Tom discovered, was the caretaker of the local school. He and several other men had been elected to be wardens by the people in the area. He sat down by Tom. You know dogs ain't allowed in shelters, sir. Tom stood up to leave, but the warden touched him gently on the arm. I think we can overlook that, though. He gazed at Tom, puzzled. Where are you from, then? You look like a countryman. I am, he answered. I've been looking for a boy what stayed with me. Evacuee he was. The warden looked astounded. I think you'd best head back home. We've hundreds of the blighters running away. We send 'em back. Makes no difference. They just come running back again. You're the first person I've met who's come looking for one. A young girl peered cautiously over the edge of one of the hammocks that was slung from the ceiling. The warden caught her eye and she lay back quickly and disappeared from sight. That's one, he said, indicating her swinging sleeping quarters. 15 times she's run back here. She says she'd rather be at home, even if the bombs do drop here, than be miserable and safe in the country. He didn't run away, said Tom. Oh. No, I had a letter from his mother saying she was ill-like, and could he come back for a while to help out. I ain't heard nothing since. How long has he been gone? Near a month. How long was he with you? Near 6 months. 6 months? Tom nodded. And he didn't run away? No. He was happy. The warden rubbed his chin with his fingers and sighed. Look here, he said. There's nothing you can do, I don't think. Could be when he got home he forgot about you. Perhaps. It's just that I like to see that the boy's well. Then I can rest peaceful like. Blimey, I never met anyone who cared that much for 'em. I hear such stories about you country folk, not nice uns neither. No offence, he added, but I can see some of you are kind-hearted lot. And, he went on, raising his voice, some people, Helen Ford and brothers, is downright ungrateful. The hammocks jiggled violently at this last remark. Maybe I can help you find this boy. What was your name? Mr. Oakley. Tom Oakley. Well, Mr. Oakley, you say he's from this area? Tom nodded and brought out the piece of paper from his pocket. The warden glanced briefly at it and looked up, startled. Why, it's in this very road. I know number 12. Willie Beach, that's the boy. Tom's heart leapt. You seen him then? Not since September. Saw a large party from school leave for the station. That's the last I saw of him. Quiet boy, didn't mix. No friends as such. Bullied and ragged a lot by the other kids. Sitting target, really. Sickly looking boy. His mother thinks she's a cut above everyone. Don't fit in here at all. Never have. Over-religious type. Bible thumping. You know what I mean? Tom nodded. Still, it's part of my job to check who's here and who's not here in case of bombing and having to identify, and I ain't been notified of him being back. I ain't seen much of her either." He glanced across the crowded shelter and waved to someone at the far end of it. "Glad might know something. Glad!" he yelled. "Glad!" A fat woman who was sitting playing cards looked up. She smiled, exposing 3 teeth in a large expanse of grinning gums. "Yes, love?" she lisped. "What is it?" "Is Mrs. Beach on night shift this week? She ain't here." "If she ever," retorted Glad. "What you want to know for?" "Man here, looking for little Willie." "Run away, has he?" "Don't think he had it in him." "No, man says Mrs. Beach wrote for him to come home." At this, Glad climbed over several sleeping bodies and lumbered towards them. "What you on about? She told me he was staying. Said he was wicked and was being sent to the home for bad boys." "Boy was never bad with me, that I can vouch for," said Tom. "Who are you then, sir?" Glad asked. "Tom Oakley." "Willie stayed with him for nearly 6 months." Glad shrugged. "I ain't seen him since September." "What about Mrs. Beach?" began Tom. "She keeps herself to herself, bit of a madam. Thinks she's a bleeding saint, if you'll excuse me language. She does night shift, so I don't never see her. I live next door, you see. Mind you," she whispered, "I don't half hear some funny noises. Very funny." "How do you mean?" queried the warden. "Bumps and whimpers." "Bumps?" "Yeah, like furniture been moved around." "What's funny about that?" "At 3 in the bleeding morning, that's what's funny. She ain't dusting her Bible." The warden turned wearily. "Looks like a dead end, don't it, Mr. Oakley?" "I'd still like to see where he lives," said Tom. "You come with me, love," said Glad. "You're fond of that Willie, then?" Tom nodded. "Queer that. You're the first person I know who is. I don't think maybe even his own mother is even fond of him." "Maybe she'll see me," said Tom. "Blimey, I forgot. She's gone away to the coast for a Bible meeting or something. She told me last week. Don't know why. She don't normally condescend to even look at me." "Why weren't I informed?" commented the warden. "It's up to her, ain't it?" The warden gave a despairing sigh. "Do you still want to see the place, Mr. Oakley?" He nodded. They had to wait a good 2 hours before they could leave. The small building grew foggy with tobacco smoke. A WVS lady in green uniform visited them with tea and sticky buns, and a man called Jack unclipped a rather battered accordion and started playing it. The small group that Glad was part of were in the middle of singing "We're Going to Hang Out the Washing on the Siegfried Line" when the all clear was sounded, and they left it unfinished in their scramble to get out. Tom was relieved to be outside again. His clothes smelt of stale tobacco and sweat, and he breathed in the night air as if it was nectar. Glad was waiting for him. Together she and the warden accompanied him to Willie's house. "She fancies herself, does our Mrs. Beach," lisped Glad. "She's got the downstairs and the upstairs room. She sometimes rents her bedroom and sleeps downstairs. Well, so she says." And she winked and gave Tom a nudge. They stood outside number 12 and peered in at the window. One of the newspapers had slid to one side. The interior seemed dark and uninhabited. The window still had brown sticky tape on it to protect the room from the blast of falling glass. "Deserted," remarked the warden. Meanwhile, Tom's attention was drawn to Sammy, who'd started to move in an agitated manner outside the window. "What's up, boy?" he asked. "You smell something?" He crouched down and stroked him. "What is it?" Sammy began to whine and scratch frantically at the front door. He ran to Tom and, clinging to his trouser leg, he pulled him towards it. "No one in there, Rover," said the warden. "Maybe," said Tom, "but it ain't like him to fuss over nothing." He jiggled at the doorknob. "You can't do that, sir. That's against the law." "I think there's someone in there," said Tom urgently. A policeman who had been attracted by the commotion joined them. "This man reckons there might be someone in there," explained the warden. "I've looked inside far as I can, and it looks empty to me." The policeman pushed back his tin helmet. "What evidence do you have, sir?" Tom pointed to Sammy, who had grown quite frantic. He began to bark loudly, still scratching feverishly at the locked door. They all glanced at each other. "I'd like to enter," suggested the warden anxiously. "I'm worried about the mother and the boy who live in there." They knocked on the door loudly, but there was no answer. Sammy leapt up and hurled himself at it. "He can smell something, by all accounts," said the policeman. After much deliberation, they decided to break the door down. Between them, Tom, the policeman, and the warden broke the wood around the lock after only 2 attempts. The door crashed open, and they were greeted with a stench so vile as to almost set them reeling. It was as if an animal had died and was rotting somewhere. Sammy ran immediately to a tiny door below the stairway and barked loudly, scrabbling at it with his paws. The odour was at its strongest there. The warden lifted aside the latch and swung the door open. The smell was rank, so much so that the warden turned his face away quickly for a moment as if to retch. The policeman pulled his torch out of his pocket and shone it into the hole.